Howdy, I'm Max Angerholzer, and on behalf of the George and Barbara Bush Foundation, I would like to thank you all for joining today's special program, which commemorates the end of the Gulf War 3 decades ago. First and foremost, I want to thank Secretary James Baker and Bret Baier for their willingness to engage in the forthcoming conversation and for allowing us all to be a part of it. I would also like to thank our outstanding team at the Foundation for the tireless hard work it took to make today a reality. And we're very appreciative for the opportunity to work hand in hand every day with Mark Welsh and his colleagues at the Bush School and Warren Finch and his team at the Presidential Library and Museum. All of us at the Bush Center and College Station are incredibly proud to be part of the Texas A&M family. During this pandemic, we have all adjusted, even the Bush Foundation, to the challenges and opportunities associated with convening virtually. Today is one of the largest events the Foundation has ever hosted. So unfortunately, I cannot thank all of our board members and friends individually, but I did want to acknowledge a few of our participants. First, Governor John Sununu, who served as President Bush's Chief of Staff in the White House and is a member of the Foundation's board. Secretary Andy Card, a former White House Chief of Staff himself and also a Foundation board member. The great Judge Bill Webster, who served as Director of the FBI and the CIA. General David Datula, the principal planner of the Desert Storm's Allied Air Campaign. Doug Silliman and Larry Silverman, both former U.S. ambassadors to Kuwait. Ambassador Al Sabah, the longtime outstanding Kuwaiti ambassador to the United States. And of course, Her Royal Highness Ambassador Rima Bandar Al Saad, Saudi Arabia's ambassador to the United States. Before moving forward with the program, however, I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge our fellow Texans who are still recovering from the terrible storms of 2 weeks ago. Today, March 2nd, is of course Texas Independence Day, and those of you who are still suffering remain in our thoughts and prayers. Now, please join me in watching a short video narrated by our dear friend Fred McClure, who is a member of the Foundation's board and one of my great predecessors as CEO. While serving in President Bush's White House, Fred helped lead the effort to build support for the joint congressional resolution that authorized the Gulf War. Take it away, please.
In the early morning hours of August 2nd, Iraqi armed forces, without provocation or warning, invaded a peaceful Kuwait. This will not stand. This will not stand, this aggression against Kuwait. If history teaches us anything, it is that we must resist aggression or it will destroy our freedoms.
Immediately after Iraq's invasion, President Bush and Secretary Baker built an international coalition of support against the occupation of Kuwait. The message was clear. Saddam Hussein's aggression was opposed not just by the United States, but the world.
If Iraq does not reverse its course peacefully, then other necessary measures, including the use of force, should be authorized. We must put the choice to Saddam Hussein in unmistakable terms.
The unprecedented multinational force gathered in the region, prepared for military action. In a final attempt to avoid war, Secretary Baker flew to Geneva and presented Iraq's foreign minister with a letter from President Bush. The letter was rebuffed. After vigorous debate, Congress authorized the use of force to liberate Kuwait.
Saddam Hussein started this cruel war against Kuwait. Tonight, the battle has been joined. 28 nations, countries from 5 continents, Europe and Asia, Africa, and the Arab League, have forces in the Gulf area standing shoulder to shoulder against Saddam Hussein. These countries had hoped the use of force could be avoided. Our goal is not the conquest of Iraq. It is the liberation of Kuwait.
After 6 weeks of air attacks, Allied forces began their ground offensive to remove Iraqi forces from Kuwait. In addition to senseless human atrocities against the Kuwaiti people, Iraq set fires to scores of oil wells and production facilities. After just 3 days of ground combat, Iraqi forces fled Kuwait.
Kuwait is liberated. Iraq's army is defeated. Our military objectives are met. Kuwait is once more in the hands of Kuwaitis in control of their own destiny. We went halfway around the world to do what is moral and just and right. We fought hard, and with others, we won the war. We lifted the yoke of aggression and tyranny from a small country that many Americans had never even heard of, and we asked nothing in return. We're coming home now, proud, confident, heads high. There is much that we must do, at home and abroad, and we will do it. We are Americans. May God bless this great nation, the United States of America. Thank you all very, very much.
Pleasure to now introduce Bret Baier. As you all know, Bret is the chief political anchor at Fox News Channel and the anchor of Special Report with Bret Baier. In his remarkable career in journalism, Bret has interviewed multiple U.S. presidents and countless heads of state. He has also reported on the ground from more than 70 countries. Bret himself is a student of history and leadership and a best-selling author. Right now, I'm actually reading his book, 3 Days at the Brink, which chronicles the 1943 Tehran Conference between Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin. I strongly recommend it. Bret, the floor is yours.
Max, thanks so much. It's a real honor to be here to mark this historic moment. I've had the good fortune of interviewing Secretary Baker several times after he left office. The most times that I've interviewed Secretary Baker happened in a place called Tallahassee, Florida in 2000, where we spent 40 days and 40 nights talking about 537 votes in the recount of 2000. But since then, several other times. And Secretary Baker, it's great to see you. How are you doing?
Well, I'm well, Bret. Thank you. It's good to see you and good to see Max. I'm delighted to be here.
Well, as former Secretary of the Treasury, White House Chief of Staff, and most importantly in this context, Secretary of State, we want to talk about the invasion of Kuwait and your recollections about it. I think it's really interesting to go back on this anniversary. You know, President Bush, as you saw in that tape, famously reacted to the invasion of Kuwait by declaring this aggression will not stand. And immediately after, in August 1990, you and President Bush really focused on building this international coalition, not with just traditional allies, but really with the Gulf states, the Soviet Union, China, and the rest of the UN Security Council. Talk about your thinking at that point with the president and how you're going to cobble this all together quickly.
Well, we always operated on the premise that it's better to go with friends than it is to try and go alone. That was certainly President Bush's mantra. I want to first say something, if I could, Brad, about the nature of his foreign policy team, because President Bush had a lot of experience in foreign policy before he became president. Of course, he had been vice president for 8 years. He'd been head of the CIA. He'd been ambassador to the UN and so forth. And he had seen how so many national security apparatus of prior presidents didn't function very well. They were always at each other's throats and so forth. And President Bush knew what he wanted in a national security team. and he saw to it that it operated that way. He picked people who had served together in prior iterations, who were friends, people like Brent Scowcroft and Dick Cheney and Colin Powell and myself. And of course, President Bush himself had served in prior iterations in the foreign affairs field and foreign policy field. So early on, I don't recall a lot of debate about whether we would try to go it alone or go it with including all of our historical partners. It was just assumed we were going to do it with our partners. The debate came a little bit later when we decided that we wanted to go to the United Nations for authorization. There was a lot of pushback to that idea within our administration and without our administration from people like Margaret Thatcher and others. And I will never forget Margaret and President Bush sitting in the wing chairs by the fireplace in the Oval Office. We're having this spirited debate about whether we should go to the UN. Margaret didn't want to do that. She was afraid we'd go for a resolution, wouldn't get it. We'd get all wrapped around the axle and we'd diminish our opportunity or the possibility of doing the job. And I never will forget her. After this debate went on for a while, she leaned over, she said, "Hey, George," she said, "let's just go do it." Well, as it turned out, we didn't just go do it. For one thing, we had a Democratic Congress. We had a House of Representatives and a Senate controlled by the opposite party. And there was a lot of opposition to the idea that we would send American men and women to fight in the Persian Gulf for a country nobody had ever heard of. And so we were having trouble getting support on the Hill. We thought, as it turned out, President Bush thought this was a good idea. We thought at the State Department, gee whiz, maybe if we waited until the United States was in the chair in the Security Council, we could get a resolution authorizing kicking this unprovoked aggressor out of Kuwait, and then we'd have the rest of the world together with us. And it would be pretty hard for a senator to answer the question, Senator, you're not going to support the president, but the president of Ethiopia is going to support him. I mean, it made a lot of difference. We needed that UN resolution politically because we were in the minority in the House and the Senate. Now, I have to tell you, I'm pretty sure President Bush would have gone and done it anyway, whether we got congressional approval or not, under his inherent commander-in-chief powers. But anyway, those are some of the memories that come back to me about the beginning of the war. It was a little while before we confronted the issue of whether we really had to go to the UN or not. And we didn't have to, but whether we really wanted to. And it's a good thing, I think, that we did.
Well, as you referenced, I mean, keeping the UN Security Council, getting them to agree on anything completely is often a challenge. But once you herd the cats, once you get the allies to go, how much of a challenge, or how did you handle keeping them on with you throughout the crisis?
Well, of course, getting the allies wasn't hard. It was extremely difficult to get Russia, to get the Soviet Union. After all, we'd been in a 40-year Cold War with the Soviet Union, and Iraq was a Soviet client state. So we were, in effect, asking the Soviet Union to support military action against one of their client states. So that was a difficult hill to climb. We also had a lot of trouble in keeping China from vetoing a use of force resolution, because this all happened in the aftermath of the Tiananmen Square massacre. And following that unfortunate event, we in the Bush administration President Bush had to sanction China because of the action that they'd taken against their own citizens. So we had to not only bring our allies into the coalition, into the table, and get them to support a military action and vote for a UN resolution authorizing it. We also had to do a lot of work with the Soviet Union and with China. This is the only time, Brett, that the UN Security Council has ever authorized force against a member state, except during the Korean War, when the Soviets walked out and the UN Security Council authorized the Korean War.
You've climbed many political hills in your illustrious career, big things you've accomplished. I've just referenced the steering of the recount down in Florida, but many big accomplishments. Where do you rank getting the UN Security Council on board and then getting approval from Congress for war?
Well, I don't think, I can't remember an instance other than maybe Korea, way back there in 1950 or so, when it's ever been done. I tell people that I think President Bush showed us, set a textbook example of the way to fight a war. He told the world what he was going to do. He went out and he did it. He brought the troops home. He did it and nothing more. Big debate about whether we should go to Baghdad and all that. That was all in the aftermath of kicking Iraq out of Kuwait. But he did this. He told the world what he was going to do. He brought the rest of the world behind him to support it. Then he got the U.S. Congress to support it. Then he did it. He brought the troops home. And guess what? He got other people to pay for 90% of the war. Now, that's never been done before or since that I'm aware of. And that's why I say it was a textbook way to handle the issue of taking the country to war.
You were with President Bush through all those big moments and decisions, and you saw your good friend, the president, have to do the thing that presidents talk about being the toughest thing they have to do, which is sending troops into harm's way. Talk to a little bit behind the scenes, lift the curtain on, well, not only your friendship with President Bush, but looking at that decision and how you kind of helped him through it.
Well, he was, as any president would, he was anxious about the prospect of casualties. We had casualty estimates from the Defense Department that ranged far above what the actual casualties in the war were. But President Bush was anxious, and you can understand why, sending other people's wives, husbands, sons, and daughters into combat. And he called me. The deadline was January, that we had given Saddam to get out of Kuwait and get out unconditionally, was January 15, 1991. And the president called me on that day and asked me to come over and have lunch. And I did. It was just the two of us in the residence quarters of the White House. And he said, Bake, he said, I know we're doing the right thing. And I think that the casualty estimates I received are good and accurate. But nevertheless, it's worrisome. And do you think we're doing the right thing? I said, absolutely. I called him Heffy, which I always called him president when other people were in the room. I said, absolutely, Heffy, it's the right thing to do. And and we had lunch and we said a little prayer, and that was it. But it showed you how he was agonizing over the decision. And then, of course, once it was made and carried out, it worked. It worked beautifully. And we suffered, even though we suffered some 300, I think, casualties, much of that was due to a friendly fire event in Dhahran, Saudi Arabia, where a Scud missile hit a facility where a lot of our people were housed.
You know, you talked about working with the Soviets. That was a challenge, obviously. You're in the middle of the Cold War, all that President Reagan had done and yet to come with what was coming under President H.W. Bush. And throughout that process, you worked with the Soviets on Kuwait. Talk about that kind of complex relationship. You knew Gorbachev. You were integral in Malta, kind of calming everything down.
Well, the president had set a policy. The policy was we wanted to work with Gorbachev and Shevardnadze, the foreign minister with whom I was very close, because we saw them as reformers. And this, of course, generated a fair amount of debate within our own administration, because we had some hardliners who thought we were being a bit too, maybe too much engagement with the Soviets and so forth and so on, and who from time to time would suggest that maybe Gorbachev wasn't going to succeed and so forth. But it ultimately paid off in this sense. I was meeting with Shevardnadze in Irkutsk, Siberia, and we were doing arms control work on the day before Iraq invaded Kuwait. And I was at a meeting when my assistant, Margaret Tutwiler, brought me a note from Bob Kimmett back in the department that said, we have disturbing intelligence that Iraq is massing on the border of Kuwait. Looks like they're going to move in. You might want to check with your interlocutor there. Well, my interlocutor was the Soviet Union's foreign minister, and Iraq was a Soviet-class state. So I said, Edward, we're really worried about the fact that maybe Iraq is going to invade Kuwait. Oh, they would never do that. He said they would not be so foolish as to do that. And I said, well, this is the intelligence we're getting. I said, you might want to, we were breaking for lunch. I said, you might want to check with the KGB and see what you find out. So he said, I will. And he came back after lunch. He said, I've checked. He said, there's nothing to it. There may be a minor cross-border incursion involving the Ramallah oil field or something, but they would not be so foolish. Well, the next morning, Saddam moved in. By that time, I had gone to Mongolia, which was this tiny little, sparsely populated, big geographically, but tiny populated a country sandwiched between the two big communist giants, China and Russia. And I had suggested to the president that I pay a visit there because they wanted to reform. They'd been they'd been under the communist system for a long, long time, and they wanted to embrace democracy, but particularly free markets, and get the benefit of the economic benefits that would come from being a free market country. And so he said, fine, go. And I went. And by that time, Saddam had invaded Kuwait. By the time I got there, I canceled the visit. I spent much of the night on the phone with him and Washington, and with some of our allied foreign ministers. And my team, Dennis Ross and Bob Zelick, had flown to Moscow with on Shevardnadze's plane from Irkutsk. I'd gone to Mongolia. They'd gone there to do some more work with the some more groundwork with the Soviets. And they suggested I fly back through Moscow, and that there might be a chance that the Soviet Union's Foreign Minister, Edward Shevardnadze, would condemn this action if I would do that. And I said, okay, I will, but I'm not going to land, and we're not going to take off unless you can tell me there's a reasonable chance he might do it. So they called me, and I left for Moscow from Ulaanbaatar, the capital of Mongolia, flew to Moscow, met with Shevardnadze at an airport in Moscow. When I got there, he had not agreed to do this. We went up to a small conference room at the airport, discussed the whole issue. I had to assure him that we were not using this just as a pretext to take military action ourselves, and sort of peremptorily and preemptively. But I said, it would really send a message to the world, Edward, if you could join in a condemnation of this action, this unprovoked aggression by a big country against a small neighbor. And he thought about it. He wanted assurance that we were not just seeking, that we were not just seeking an excuse. And finally, he agreed to support an arms embargo and to condemn Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. And then we went downstairs and met the press in the lobby of that Moscow airport, and we stood shoulder to shoulder and condemned the action of Iraq in invading Kuwait. And I wrote in my memoirs that to me marked the end of the Cold War. When you get the American Secretary of State and the Soviet Foreign Minister standing shoulder to shoulder and condemning the actions of a Soviet client state, that Cold War must be ending. And that's the way it came down as far as I was concerned. Now, we had a lot of difficulties later, Bret, keeping the Soviets in the coalition. For one thing, Iraq immediately, within a couple of days, violated the arms embargo and was sending a ship to Oman that we were concerned was going to pick up arms or was loaded with arms. I can't remember which. And we had a huge debate internally, and many of our allies wanted us to take that ship out. You can't let that ship go, Mr. President. You'll be seen as a wimp. I mean, you can't walk away from your commitments here. Unfortunately, I was at my remote ranch in Wyoming, and communicating with the president through a taxat on a big boulder outside my cabin. And he said, I think we really need to take that ship out. I said, please, Mr. President, don't do that. I said, we've got a chance that we've now got the Soviet Union condemning this. We're going to build this coalition. We have a chance that they will stay with us. But if we take that ship out, they won't. Shevardnadze had called me and said, please give us a day or two to work on Baghdad, to work on Saddam, see if we can't get that ship to turn around. And you know what? The president decided with me. You know why he did that? 40 years of friendship, 40 years of working together as friends and in politics. But we had everybody else in our administration saying, you got to take the ship out. We had Thatcher and other allies saying, you got to take the ship out. And I was saying, give the Soviets a couple of days. And it worked, fortunately. I really didn't expect to win that argument, but we did. And the president made the right decision when you look at it in hindsight, because we kept the Soviets in the coalition. And if we hadn't, we never could have gotten that use of force resolution from the Security Council, which was critical to then winning a vote particularly in the Senate, which we barely won, 52-48, winning a vote to authorize the war. As I said earlier, the president would have done it anyway because it was the right thing to do under his inherent commander-in-chief powers.
You went to all the good places there, Siberia, Mongolia, and those stories. It was powerful to see you and the foreign minister making those statements. I want to turn to, there's a lot of focus on President Bush saying this aggression
will not stand.
Will not stand, right. But a lot of people don't look back at what exactly was happening in Kuwait and the really personal attacks, atrocities that Iraqis were committing on Kuwaitis. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, I have a lot of memories about that. Those didn't start immediately. They started after a day or two of the occupation. They were brutal. When I would go visit the Kuwait government in exile in Taif, Saudi Arabia, where they were located after they left Kuwait City, I would drive up. I would fly into Dhahran, Saudi Arabia, and then drive with the Kuwaiti foreign minister, Sheikh Sabah, who just passed away recently, to Taif, and they would show us pictures of the atrocities, show me pictures of those atrocities, and they were brutal, and the occupation was brutal, and I remember another instant. I remember, Bret, is that the head of the Episcopal Church in the United States came into the Oval Office before the war started to convince the president not to go to war. War was evil, war was bad, so forth and so on. And I remember we took some of those pictures of these poor people who'd been brutalized, tortured, and badly mistreated, and showed them to the head of the Episcopal Church, who was encouraging us not to take the action we took. But it was a brutal occupation. It was unprovoked. It was one that should have been reversed. And the president pretty much realized that early on and took exactly the right action, of course.
And obviously, President Bush is revered in Kuwait as a
there are a lot of children. There are a lot of children named Bush in Kuwait.
Bush and George. That's right. Well, as we're talking about that, it did change the dynamics in the Middle East. Talk about the way the Gulf War changed the diplomacy with Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, Qatar.
Well, they were pretty close to us, but you have to remember, Kuwait had been aligned with the Soviet Union, believe it or not, in the Cold War, and this little country that we went over there sent 500,000 troops to liberate had been aligned with the Soviets. Most of the other of those Gulf countries had been friendly to the United States, and they remained so. But in pulling the coalition together, I remember traveling to every one of those capitals and seeking their both political support and financial support. We got a lot of support financially from both Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. My recollection is $15 billion from each country, and they became even more closely aligned with the United States than they had been.
It changed the dynamic, definitely. You were obviously a key participant in the president's war cabinet. Talk about how that group came together and how they worked together.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I think President Bush knew how a national security team ought to function, and he saw to it that his team functioned that way. That's why he put people who had worked together in prior iterations on that team, and we worked very, very closely together. I like to say, I don't think this is too arrogant to say this, but I think that we represented the exception to the rule that most national security teams for other presidents have been hotbeds of conflict and argument and sometimes leaking on each other, backstabbing, not supporting. We didn't have any of that because we had all been friends. We had all worked together, and we functioned extremely smoothly together. Were there differences of view? You bet. I've mentioned one. Take out that ship. There were others. Don't go to the UN. But we resolved all those. And for the most part, I think if you look at history, if you look at the record of President Bush 41's national security apparatus, you would conclude that that's the way a president ought to run his national security apparatus. And he was very, this is, I guess, a personal view of a former Secretary of State, but the statute books say that Secretary of State will be the president's principal foreign policy advisor and implementer. President Bush knew that was important. He protected me, he defended me, even when I was wrong. And there were times when I was wrong, and yet he was there for me. But what that did was give us a very cohesive national security team that functioned very, very smoothly together. I never will forget Brent Scowcroft was the national security advisor. He'd been that with Jerry Ford. Dick Cheney and I had worked closely with him in the Ford Carter election in '76 and in the Ford White House. And the minute President Bush consulted with me before he chose Brent, I said I thought it'd be great. After Brent was nominated, picked by President Bush, Brent came to me and said, I want to tell you something. I've had this job before and I know the job, and I'm the national security advisor and you're the Secretary of State, and I will never go on television unless it's okay with you. Well, how about that? Most times national security advisors and secretaries of state fight like hell. But that made it okay as far as I was concerned for him to go on TV any damn time he wanted to. And we were very close. And I've always been close as well with Dick Cheney. But the secretaries of state and defense, there's always tension between defense and state. And the bureaucracies like to get their secretaries to go and butt heads and argue their positions. Dick and I would have breakfast once a week in Brent Scowcroft's office, and we'd work out most of these differences. I bet we didn't take, in 4 years, I bet we didn't take 4 or 5 issues to the president for resolution. We worked them out. It was a very, very closely knit team.
That's pretty amazing. You've seen so much in your years in service to the country. I have so many questions I could ask you, but if you look now, what do you think is the biggest challenge facing our country?
Well, I think there are a couple of them, Brett. I get that question from time to time. I think the biggest challenge, frankly, is our political dysfunction. We are not getting the people's business done. We send people to Washington today who seem to want to argue and fight a hell of a lot more than they want to work on getting the people's business done. And I think that political dysfunction is extremely harmful to the United States. And I don't know how, frankly, you're going to overcome it. I have some ideas about why it has developed, but I'm not quite sure how we're going to overcome it. And the second biggest challenge, in my view, as a former Treasury Secretary, is this incredible, humongous, ticking fiscal debt bomb that we're creating. We have a debt to GDP now of in excess of 100%. That's not sustainable for any country, we do not have the political will to deal with it. President Obama appointed the Simpson-Bowles Commission. It was a good commission. They came in with a great report. Democrats have to consider cuts in spending, and Republicans have to consider tax increases or increases in revenue. And it was a good report, but they walked away from it. The administration didn't adopt it. But barring something like that, I have to tell you, as a former Treasury Secretary, I don't see how we get out of this box. Because when interest rates go up, and they will, we're going to be paying inordinate amounts of money to the holders of our paper, our Treasury securities, to Japan, to China, and others. And I see no way out other than, and what I think is going to happen is that we're going to inflate our way out of it. Sorry, we're going to inflate our way out of it, and your dollar is going to be cheaper, get less valuable and less valuable. But that's a real threat, but the biggest threat is our political dysfunction.
The debt is amazing. It's a thing that has been forgotten in Washington, it seems.
Yeah.
Both parties have talked about it. And interest rates go up 1 point. We'll be paying more on interest on the national debt than we pay to the Pentagon every year.
That's correct. That's correct. And that used to be one of the major issues debated by our policymakers. Nobody talks about the debt anymore.
You talk about the dysfunction and the partisanship. It used to be that there were a lot of friendships that went across party lines. Today we saw that Vernon Jordan passed away, and I just wanted to give you a moment. I know you knew him to reflect on his life.
He was a beautiful human being. He was a very, very close friend of mine. He was a political opponent, but never a political enemy. He and I, after the Bush-Clinton race in '92, Vernon was instrumental with the Clintons in the transition. I never will forget him showing up at my house in Washington, D.C., the day or 2 days after the election, wanting to come in and talk about transition. He was there with Warren Christopher, who was working on the transition as well. And then in 2004, Vernon and I were picked by Al Gore and George W. Bush to negotiate the rules of the second debate between the two. Negotiate some debate rules between those two candidates. And we didn't spend much time at all. We worked it out in a relatively short period of time. And then we repaired to the bar at the Waldorf Astoria and had vodka martinis and told dirty jokes. And he was a real friend of mine and a beautiful human being. And he was the kind of political opponent that you like to deal with on the other side.
Yeah. Well, Mr. Secretary, it's been great talking to you. You look great. You feel good. You've been vaccinated?
Well, I've had my second shot. Yeah, I had it last Wednesday. It knocked me for a loop, but I've had it. I'm feeling okay, Bret. I still am fortunate. I'm a lucky guy. I'll be 91 years old in 2 months, and I'm still running after bird dogs, quail hunting.
That's great. Mr. Secretary, thanks so much for the time. It's been a real honor for me.
Thank you, Bret.
Max, I'll send it back to you.
Thank you, Bret. And thank you both for this really compelling and enlightening conversation. Hearing this firsthand account of this pivotal period in history was incredible and provides important lessons for today, as we discussed, and for the future. And Secretary Baker, thank you especially for your leadership and service and your whole career, 1991 and today, of course. Really appreciate y'all both taking some time with us. I'll close by thanking everybody here for spending the last hour with us. The Bush Foundation is proud to support the Bush School and the Bush Presidential Library and Museum, and to share and amplify the legacies of President and Mrs. Bush. We feel that with the current challenges that we've discussed today, facing the U.S. and our friends abroad, the ideals and virtues by which George and Barbara Bush lived their lives, their humility, their selfless commitment to service, these are all more important now than they've ever been. I hope you will join all of us as we seek to share more of George and Barbara Bush with the world. We will have more virtual opportunities in the months ahead and hope to be able to hold in-person events later this year. Have a great day and gig 'em.